So you guys really seem to enjoy the last two God release history episodes, so today we're diving right back into the past of Smite with release Nemesis. So for those new to this series, I essentially take an in-depth look at the release date of a certain god, in this case Nemesis, and how they fared in the meta, plus a quick look at the various nerfs or buffs they've needed over the time they've been out to get them back in line. So Nemesis hasn't actually had any reworked abilities or anything like that, but don't let that fool you. Her numbers at launch were absolutely dumb, combined with a kit that was already strong with a ton of synergies, and it made for one massively OP warrior. Yeah, she was a warrior for a while on release before they realised she plays much better as an assassin. So on February 6, 2014, Nemesis was released. The most iconic part of her kit back in the day that everyone probably remembers would definitely be the Retribution shield. You see, back then this shield had no limit to how much damage, reflect and healing it could give. So nowadays it has a limit of 100 up to 500 health depending on the level of the ability, and it reflects and heals less if it's at a lower rank. On release, however, the health limit didn't even exist, and it reflected 50% and healed for 100% of damage taken regardless of the ability rank. So even if you left it at rank 1 all game, it was still broken as hell. So essentially, since it had no limit, you could deliberately walk into something like a Vulcan ult and just watch his life flash before his eyes as he deals 600 plus damage back to him and heal for about 80% of your health. It was easily one of the dumbest abilities ever added to the game back then, where now it's hard limited to 250 damage reflect and 500 healing at max rank, which is still strong given it also negates 500 damage as well. It could have gone infinite back then as long as people were still hitting you. Granted, it did only last a single second, so it was a lot harder to use and was a little weaker against gods like Hunters that pump out consistent damage. But even then, if you reflect 2 crits from a late game Hunter, you're probably doing 700 damage to them at least and healing for 1400, so that was still absolutely absurd. But where it really shined was against any kind of mage like the Vulcan, as you could literally just stand there and they wouldn't attack you for fear of one-shotting themselves and full healing you. It was like Thorns on absolute steroids. Oh, and the cherry on top of this ability, it had a 12-second cooldown. So if you built a little bit of CDR, it was on a lower cooldown than most abilities in the game at that point, so you nearly always had it up to counter an enemy mage ability at will. As it is now, the shield still broke when she was hit by a hard crowd control, but on release she also got the heals and damage reflect from the damage she took, even if it was broken by CC. So if we take Scylla's Sikkim for example, currently Scylla's Sikkim, it will just break the shield immediately and she'll receive no damage reflect or healing. Back at release she'd receive full benefit even if she was CC'd. So yeah, even the way that's boasted as the way to counter this ability didn't even work properly back then. So that took a while, but we're not even done yet with this broken release. So Nems 2 back then was also pretty absurd. It slowed for 50% regardless of rank, so even at level 1, if you land this on a god with no movement, it's basically a free kill since being slowed by 50% is almost like being rooted and it lasted 2 seconds. Oh, and it also had a 7-second cooldown. Don't ask why an ability that does 280 and 100% scaling with ridiculous CC had a lower cooldown than almost every ability in the game. I don't know. If you built CDR, this was literally on a 4-second cooldown, and given the slow lasted 2 seconds, you could keep enemies slowed for literally half the time they're alive. It was absolutely stupid. So quickly before we get into the mess that is release Nemesis' ultimate, her dash at release was actually the one part of a kit that was kinda balanced. Where now you can use other abilities and auto attacks in between the dashes for extra synergy, at release this wasn't actually possible. Still, at release it was intended to only activate the second dash if you hit an enemy god with the first dash. Apparently that bug never got removed and it became a feature of the ability, so given that this did 170 base and 50% scaling per hit back then, just her dash did a lot more than other assassins' abilities could do on their dedicated damage abilities. And also any small amount of mobility Nem could get her hands on just exacerbated the problems she already had with her ridiculous slows and all that stuff. So while the shield was incredibly flashy in the things it was capable of, such as standing in a Vulcan ult and one-shotting him, her ultimate was easily the most bloated and most OP ability she had. Possibly the most bloated ability in the entire game at the point of her release. So let me just list off all the shit that this ability does to put it in perspective. 50% of the target's maximum health, a 50% slow for 5 seconds, 50% protection reduction on the target for 5 seconds, increases Nem's protections by that same 50% for 10 seconds, increases Nem's movement speed by 50%, also for 10 seconds, oh and it can't miss. Like, what did I even just read? You could just pick any 3 of these 5 effects and it would still be a ludicrously strong ability. Literally the only weakness of this ability is that it can only target one person. But that one person is basically dead as soon as you move your targeter onto them, and you basically have the defenses of a tank and the movement speed of a Thanatos with speed boost for 10 whole seconds. Seriously, ulting a tank with this will reduce their protections of both kinds by probably at minimum about 100, usually more, and then increase Nems by the same amount for 10 seconds. How is that even close to fair? Not to mention the enemy almost can't move and was dealt half their HP bar instantly from an ability that can't miss. Yeah, this is definitely among the top 5 most bloated abilities of all time. I dare say this was even better than release Guanult. So as you may have guessed, if you have the correct amount of chromosomes, some nerfs were in order for our little friend here. The first patch after her release, they halved the scaling on both her 1 and her 2, so they now only hit for a max 50% scaling, not 100%. Kinda makes sense since they were trying to push her as a warrior and not an assassin at the time. They also fixed an issue I wasn't even aware of until doing research for this video. Apparently if you used Aegis during her shield, it wouldn't go on cooldown and you could use the shield again instantly. You know, just to add insult to injury on that already broken ability. Just 4 days later, Hi-Rez realised they had a real mess on their hands and brought down the nerf hammer pretty hard, nearly halving the usefulness of her passive, taking the slowdown at the earlier ranks of her 2, though at rank 5 it was still 50%. Massively increasing the shield cooldown from 12 seconds to 18 seconds, and also fixing the fact that it would trigger on Gold Furies, Fire Giants and Titans, because for some reason that was a thing. 8 days later, more nerfs, increasing the cooldown of Slice and Dice finally from that absurdly low 7 seconds up to a still pretty low 10 seconds, but it's an improvement I guess. They also hammered the slower movement speed buff on the ult from 30 up to 50% to just a flat 25% at all ranks. Less noticeable in the early ranks, but a serious hit in the late game. They also altered the way her passive worked so she benefited less from having high power herself and more from hitting targets with high power, probably to push her away from building damage and more towards that warrior role they had envisioned for her at launch. A little while later she received a couple small nerfs, increasing the cooldown once again on Slice and Dice to now a somewhat reasonable 13 seconds, and also reducing the buff duration on her ult down to 8 seconds from 10. But the real kicker came next patch, where she got absolutely annihilated in the shield department into what it is today, having that maximum health cap which really limited the frustration potential of fighting an NEM with this ability. And the final bit we'll talk about was her change into an assassin. She wasn't reworked for this, she just had some stat changes, bringing down her health and defenses in exchange for more attack speed. While she has received even more nerfs after this, and at this point she was getting there in terms of balance, these are the most important nerfs closely after her release. But yeah, that was Nemesis. Definitely one of the strongest god releases of all time, with her ridiculous damage and also somehow having a ton of mobility and survivability as well. Not to mention the ultimate. So let me know your thoughts on release Nem, especially if you were around for it. I still remember the days farming Pentas in Arena with her at release, but she's in a much better place now. As always, let me know which god history you want me to cover next, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace out, you nerds.